The 50th floor executive boardroom is dead silent. 50 of Manhattan's elite architects stare in absolute horror as the mahogany doors swing open. Richard stands at the head of the table, his face flushed crimson with rage, clutching a stolen $500 million skyscraper design. Security! Richard screams, spit flying from his lips as he points a trembling finger at the doorway. Get this dirty, uneducated trash out of my presentation before I have him arrested. Two heavily armed corporate guards lunge forward, grabbing the arms of the black man standing in the doorway. He is wearing faded gray coveralls. His hands are calloused from industrial bleach. But Marcus doesn't flinch. He doesn't struggle. He simply stares at the sweating executive with terrifying, absolute calm. He reaches slowly into his stained pocket. What Richard didn't know was about to end his entire career.
Wrong move. He just ordered security to arrest the sole investor funding his entire empire. Let's get into it.
The lobby was vast, cold, and perfectly silent. It breathed at night, not with warmth, but with the particular stillness of a place that belonged entirely to money. Marcus pushed his mop bucket slowly across the imported Italian marble. The wheels squeaked. Each squeak bounced off the high glass walls, sharp, small, and immediately swallowed by the dark. He didn't mind the sound. He had worked this floor for 11 months. He knew every inch of it. By midnight, the grand lobby of Vance and Associates was entirely empty. The security desk sat unmanned. The elevator banks glowed amber, idle and waiting. Marcus, the one who swept this lobby every night without a single word of acknowledgement, moved in long practice strokes. His boots scuffed and rubber-soled, pressed against the Italian marble with each step. The squeak was consistent, rhythmic, and almost musical. He had learned to ignore it. Most things he had learned to ignore. Then the elevator chimed. The sound was sharp, sudden, and completely wrong for that hour. Marcus paused. He did not turn around. He simply listened. The door slid open with a soft, mechanical hiss. Heavy footsteps followed, deliberate, aggressive, and expensive. Marcus recognized the sound immediately. He had heard those shoes before. A $4,000 bespoke Armani suit did not merely enter a room. It announced itself. Richard Vane stepped into the lobby. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and entirely aware of it. His rose-gold Patek Philippe caught the overhead light as he adjusted his cuff. He was speaking already. He had not yet seen Sarah. She was standing near her cubicle, exhausted, hollow-eyed, and trembling slightly. She held a drafting sheet against her chest like a shield. "Do you have any idea," Richard said, "what this error costs me?" He did not wait for an answer. He never did. A junior employee who cannot catch a drafting mistake before review is not an employee. She is a liability, a waste, and frankly an embarrassment to this firm. Sarah's jaw tightened. Her hands gripped the drafting sheet harder. She did not speak. Richard leaned forward, slow, deliberate, and entirely without mercy. "You are replaceable. You understand that. Completely, totally, and without question, replaceable." The words hit the marble floor and stayed there. Marcus did not move. He stood perfectly still, his mop handle gripped loosely in one calloused hand. His face was neutral, composed, and entirely unreadable. He was invisible. That was the point. A night shift janitor in faded gray coveralls was furniture. He was part of the building. Richard had walked past him 17 times in 11 months without once registering his existence. Sarah pressed her lips together. She nodded once tight, small, and barely visible. Richard straightened his cuffs, smoothed his jacket, and turned without another word. He walked back toward the elevator. He did not look at Marcus. He looked through him. The elevator doors closed. The lobby went silent again. Sarah stood for a long moment. Then slowly she sat down at her desk and pressed both palms flat against the surface. She stared at nothing. Marcus resumed mopping. He did not hurry. He did not slow. He simply continued. By the time he reached the far end of the lobby near the glass partition, the night had settled into its familiar rhythm again, quiet, cold, and relentlessly indifferent. He parked the bucket near the wall. He reached into the front pocket of his coveralls, worn but clean, and withdrew a small leather journal. It was scuffed at the corners. The spine was cracked from use. He opened it to the current page. The top half held a cleaning checklist, neat and methodical. The bottom half was something else entirely. Lines of structural load-bearing equations filled the remaining space, precise, dense, and written in a hand far steadier than anything a mop handle should have produced. He worked in silence. He calculated stress distributions. He noted wind coefficients. He sketched a load path diagram next to the item that read, East Corridor, 3rd floor, reseal grout line. He paused. He tapped the pen against a specific figure. He circled it once, slow and deliberate. He looked up at the ceiling far above him, thinking. Then he wrote 3 words beside the circled number, 40th floor, verify. He closed the journal. He tucked it into his breast pocket. He picked up the mop handle again. The acrid chemical smell of industrial bleach drifted faintly through the lobby. It was sharp, clean, and entirely honest. It did not try to be anything other than what it was. Richard's Tom Ford cologne had settled into the air after him, expensive, suffocating, and already beginning to fade. Marcus noticed the difference. He always noticed. He pushed the bucket forward. The wheels squeaked. The marble gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights, cold, immaculate, and entirely indifferent to the man crossing it. Marcus paused once more near the center of the lobby, the enormous Vance and Associates insignia carved into the floor beneath his feet. He looked down at it. He said nothing. He moved on. But Richard Vane had no idea whose eyes had been watching from the shadows. Later that night, the lobby settled into something heavier than silence. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against the walls, slow, thick, and full of things left unsaid. Sarah had not moved from her desk. She sat beneath the single fluorescent light still burning in her cubicle row, surrounded by darkness on every side. Her shoulders curved inward. Her hands rested in her lap. On the drafting table before her stood the model. It was extraordinary. Even in the harsh, unforgiving light, the skyscraper model commanded attention. Sarah had built it over 14 weeks, late nights and early mornings, sacrificed weekends, cold coffee, and eyes that burned from staring at blueprints too long. Every joint was precise. Every beam placement intentional. It rose from its base in clean, ambitious lines, nearly 4 feet tall and impossibly delicate. It was also leaning. The lean was subtle at first, a fraction of a degree, nearly invisible to anyone who had not spent weeks memorizing every angle of the thing. But Sarah had spent weeks. She saw it immediately. She had been watching it worsen for the past hour, slow and patient the way a disaster always announces itself before it arrives. The balsa wood joints at the 38th floor junction were bearing uneven load. The entire upper structure was drifting almost imperceptibly toward the left edge of the table. Sarah placed both hands against the base, carefully, gently, and completely uselessly. The model was too tall, too top-heavy, and too far along in its drift for hand pressure to fix anything. She needed to recalibrate the base tension. She needed tools she did not have at her desk at this hour. She needed more than anything someone who understood structural physics well enough to tell her where the actual failure point was hiding. She got Marcus instead. He stepped out of the shadows near the East Corridor, quietly, unhurried, and entirely without ceremony. He had not been watching her. He had simply been working, and the work had brought him here. And here was a person in obvious distress beside a structure that was about to become very expensive debris. He stopped a few feet away. "May I?" he said. That was all. 2 words, low and calm, offered without assumption or pressure. Sarah looked up. She was startled, then cautious, then after a moment simply too exhausted to be either. She nodded once. "It's going to fall," she said. Her voice was flat, hollow, and entirely stripped of hope. "I can't find the failure point. If it goes, the whole upper section splinters. 14 weeks. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. 14 weeks. Marcus set his mop handle against the partition wall. He approached the model slowly, his rough, bleach-stained hands open at his sides, deliberate and visible. He did not touch it. Not yet. He crouched slightly, bringing his eye level to the 35th floor mark, and studied the lean with quiet, focused attention. He tilted his head slightly. He looked at the base. He looked at the junction. He looked at the top. Then he reached out. 2 fingers placed with surgical precision against the northeastern corner of the 37th floor plate. He did not push. He simply rested them there, feeling. Sarah watched, silent, motionless, and barely breathing. "Here," Marcus said. He did not look at her. The load path shifted at the 36th floor. The northeastern bearing column is taking approximately 40% more compression than the design intends. The upper mass is compensating by drifting. If it continues another 2 degrees, the balsa at the 38th junction will snap. He paused. Not all of it, just the forward left joint, but that will be enough. Sarah stared at him. She said nothing for a long moment. "How do you know that?" Her voice was careful, measured, and genuinely confused. Marcus did not answer immediately. He straightened slowly, crossed to her drafting table, and scanned the open blueprint with calm, practiced eyes. His bleach-stained hands hovered above the paper without touching it. He found what he was looking for in seconds. He picked up a red pen from the cup beside the drafting lamp. "May I mark the blueprint?" Sarah hesitated. It was a classified corporate model. It was Richard's project officially, though every line on those blueprints had come from her hands and her mind. She looked at the red pen. She looked at Marcus. "Yes," she said quietly. He drew a clean, precise circle at the 40th floor wind shear point. Inside the circle, he wrote 3 numbers and a coefficient. He set the pen down carefully. "That is your real problem," he said. His voice was calm, steady, and completely without performance. "The model is failing at the 36th floor because the design does not account for lateral wind shear loading above the 40th. The base drift is a symptom. This mark is the cause. If that floor is built as drawn, the actual structure will experience critical stress accumulation in a sustained 60-mile-per-hour crosswind event. It will not collapse immediately, but it will fail progressively, over years." The sharp, terrifying snap of balsa wood split the silence. A single joint at the 38th floor junction gave way sudden and decisive. The upper section lurched. Sarah lunged forward. Marcus was already there. His hands, calloused, steady, and precise, caught the upper assembly from both sides simultaneously. He held it without straining. He did not fumble. He simply held it patient and firm until the momentum died. Then carefully and methodically he began the correction. He spoke as he worked quiet and technical, explaining each adjustment, each rebalancing of load, each small correction that compounded into stability. Sarah listened. She handed him what he asked for. Within 20 minutes, the model stood vertical, balanced, and no longer drifting. It looked exactly as it had in her original vision. It looked better. Sarah exhaled slowly. She sat back in her chair, silent, drained, and entirely unable to explain what had just happened. She looked at the red circle on the blueprint. She looked at Marcus. He was already picking up his mop handle from against the partition wall. "Thank you," she said. The words felt inadequate. She knew it as she said them. Marcus nodded once. He looked at the model for a moment longer, calm, quiet, and entirely unreadable. "The mark stays," he said. "Don't let anyone erase it." He turned. He pushed the mop bucket forward. The wheels squeaked against the marble, familiar, rhythmic, and fading. That was the exact moment Richard stepped out of the private elevator. The elevator doors opened slowly. Richard stepped out with the particular ease of a man who had never once doubted his right to occupy any space he entered. He was still in his suit. The jacket was immaculate, the collar crisp, and the rose-gold Patek Philippe caught the corridor light as he turned his wrist. He had come back for something. He had not expected to find anyone here. He saw Sarah first, then the model, then Marcus. The sequence mattered. It took Richard approximately 3 seconds to process the scene, and in those 3 seconds, his expression moved through surprise, confusion, and something darker, something territorial and immediate before settling on cold, focused fury. He walked forward. His footsteps were deliberate, hard, and entirely without hesitation. "What," Richard said, "is this?" It was not a question. His voice was flat, low, and precisely controlled the voice of a man who had spent decades practicing the art of making other people feel small. He stopped at the edge of the cubicle. His eyes moved from the model to the blueprint. They stopped at the red circle, the 3 numbers, the coefficient written in Marcus's steady hand. His jaw tightened. "Who touched this model?" He looked at Sarah. She opened her mouth. He cut her off before a single syllable escaped. "Who gave a janitor permission to put his dirty hands on a $50 million corporate asset?" His eyes moved to Marcus then. They traveled slowly, deliberately, and with complete contempt from the scuffed rubber soles of his work boots to the faded gray collar of his coveralls. "You," the word landed like something thrown. "You touched this." Marcus said nothing. He stood quietly, mop handle in hand, his face composed and entirely neutral. He did not step back. He did not look away. He simply waited. Richard moved to the model. He circled it once, inspecting his heavy gold Rolex, catching the fluorescent light as he ran a finger along the base. He found the correction points Marcus had made. He studied them for a moment. Then he straightened, smoothed his jacket, and turned to face the room with the expression of a man delivering a verdict. "Get out," he said. He was looking at Marcus. Marcus did not move immediately. He looked at Sarah once, a single brief glance. Then he reached for the mop bucket handle. Richard stepped forward and kicked the base of the plastic cart hard and sudden. The bucket scraped violently across the marble and slammed into the corridor wall with a hollow, cracking sound. Dirty water sloshed over the rim. The mop handle clattered to the floor. The sound was enormous in the silence. It bounced off every glass wall, sharp, ugly, and impossible to ignore. Sarah flinched. Marcus did not. "I said get out!" Richard's voice had not risen. That was the worst part. It was still perfectly controlled, smooth, and absolutely merciless. "You do not belong in this space. You do not belong near this model. You do not belong on this floor." He moved closer. He was taller than Marcus by 2 inches and used every one of them. Dirty, uneducated hands have no business touching the work of people who actually built something with their lives. He turned to the blueprint then. He found the red circle immediately. He found the numbers, the coefficient, the 3 words Marcus had written in careful, precise notation. His lip curled. He picked up an eraser from Sarah's drafting cup. "Worthless janitor graffiti," he said. He erased the circle with 3 aggressive strokes. He erased the numbers. He erased the coefficient. He did not look at the math. He did not read it. He simply removed it thoroughly and completely because it offended him that it existed at all. He set the eraser down and dusted his fingers against each other with a small, satisfied motion. Sarah made a sound. It was barely audible, barely a breath, but it was there. Richard heard it. He turned to her slowly. "You will not speak," he said. "Not tonight, not tomorrow, not in any room where I am present." He stepped closer to the drafting table. He looked at the model long and appraising. He looked at the blueprint now clean of the red mark. He looked at the folder beside it thick with Sarah's detailed structural notes, her load calculations, her wind resistance data, her 14 weeks of meticulous, painstaking work. He picked up the folder. He picked up the blueprint. He tucked both under his arm with the casual ease of a man picking up his own newspaper from his own front step. He looked at the model for one final moment. Then he turned to the 2 remaining security guards who had appeared silently at the corridor entrance. "Have this model moved to the presentation suite tonight," Richard said. Carefully. He straightened his cuffs. "I present to the billionaire client at 9 tomorrow morning." He looked at Sarah, then one last time, flat and direct. "If you speak a single word about tonight to anyone, Security, HR, a colleague, a friend. Your name will never appear on another architectural project in this city. I will make certain of it." He paused, deliberate and unhurried. "You are talented enough to ruin. Remember that." He walked back toward the elevator without looking at Marcus again. The guards moved to the model. One of them wrapped careful hands around the base. The other steadied the upper assembly. They carried it away with the focused attention of men who understood what it cost and what it meant to the man who had just claimed it. The corridor was empty in under a minute, quick, complete, and absolutely final. Richard's cruel laughter drifted back from the elevator lobby, low and satisfied, bouncing off the glass cubicle walls like something that did not belong in a civilized building. Sarah sat very still. Her hands were flat on the drafting table. Her eyes were dry. The weeping came from somewhere deeper than tears, somewhere quiet and collapsed, and entirely private. Marcus stood in the corridor. His mop bucket sat against the wall, dented, now streaked with dirty water that had dried in uneven lines down the side. He looked at it for a moment. He looked at the empty space where the model had stood. He looked at the blank patch on the blueprint where the red circle had been. He reached into his coverall pocket. He withdrew the worn leather journal. He opened it to the current page, found the circled figure, found the 3 words he had written beside it earlier. He looked at them for a long moment, patient still and entirely calm. He closed the journal. He tucked it back into his breast pocket. But Richard's arrogance had just triggered a chain reaction he could not stop.
Absolutely not. He just stole her life's work and physically attacked a man for trying to help. If that were me, I wouldn't have stayed silent in that hallway. Imagine pouring your absolute soul into a design just to watch a bully claim it as his own. Some people never learn.
By 7 the next morning, Vance and Associates was alive. The lobby, cold and empty just hours before, now moved with the particular energy of a firm preparing to perform. Architects arrived in pressed suits carrying portfolios, speaking in low, purposeful voices. Assistants moved quickly between desks. The espresso machine behind the reception counter ran continuously. The whole building had the feel of a stage being set, polished, arranged, and lit for an audience of 1. The billionaire client was expected at 9. Marcus arrived at 6:45 as he always did. He came through the service entrance on the building's north side, quiet and unremarkable. His faded gray coveralls already on his cleaning cart, loaded and ready. He had a floor to finish before the firm opened properly. He worked without speaking. He moved through the lobby in long practice strokes, patient, methodical, and entirely invisible to the stream of suited professionals flowing past him in both directions. No one looked at him. No one nodded. No one registered his presence at all. He was furniture. He was the gleaming floor beneath their expensive shoes. He pushed his bucket forward. The wheels squeaked. He continued. Richard arrived at 8:15. He came through the main entrance, broad and unhurried, his bespoke Armani jacket sitting perfectly on his shoulders. His monogrammed leather briefcase hung from one hand. His Patek Philippe caught the morning light as he pushed through the glass doors, and he paused just inside the entrance, surveying the lobby with the slow, satisfied expression of a man who believed entirely that everything in his field of vision belonged to him. His eyes found Marcus. The pause was brief, a flicker. Then something shifted in Richard's expression, something deliberate and cold. The decision forming visibly behind his eyes before his face had fully committed to it. He walked forward. He did not walk toward his office. He walked toward the center of the lobby. He walked toward Marcus. He stopped 6 feet away. He said nothing for a moment. He simply looked slow and contemptuous at the man holding the mop handle. Around them, the morning flow of architects continued. Conversations continued. The espresso machine continued. Nobody had noticed yet. Then Richard spoke. He did not lower his voice. "You." The word carried across the lobby with perfect clarity. Heads began to turn. "Step away from the equipment." He reached into his jacket. He withdrew a monogrammed silver money clip, thick and heavy, and peeled 3 $100 bills from it with the practiced ease of a man who had performed this gesture before. He held them loosely between 2 fingers. "You're done here," Richard said. His voice was clear, unhurried, and entirely without private. He wanted the room. He had calculated the room. "Effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building." He looked at the 3 bills in his hand for a moment, almost thoughtful, then dropped them. Not handed. Dropped. They fell in a slow, separate drift, landing on the wet marble floor at Marcus's feet, face up, crisp and deeply offensive. The lobby went silent. Not gradually. All at once, immediate and absolute, the way sound disappears in the moment before something breaks. 50 architects stood at their desks in the corridors near the elevator banks and stared. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence was deafening, suffocating, and entirely unanimous. Every one of them looked at their shoes, their phones, their portfolios, anywhere that was not the center of the lobby. Fear was a specific kind of gravity in a place like this. It pulled everything downward and inward, and nobody in that room was immune to it. Sarah stood near the corridor entrance. She had arrived early. She had not slept. Her face was pale still and carefully arranged into an expression that gave nothing away. She watched Richard drop the bills. She watched them land. She felt something move through her chest, hot and immediate, and she pressed both hands flat against her sides to keep herself still. Richard looked at her. It was brief and precise, a single glance that communicated everything it needed to without a single additional word. It said not one syllable. It said, "I told you what happens." It said, "I will end your career before it begins, and I will enjoy it, and there will be nothing you can do." Sarah looked back at him. She did not look away, but she did not speak. Marcus looked at the 3 bills on the floor. He stood for a long moment, mop handle in hand, his face composed neutral and completely terrifyingly blank. He did not react with anger, he did not react with shame, he did not react at all, not in any way that Richard had clearly anticipated, not in any way that gave the watching room the spectacle they were bracing for. He bent down slowly. He picked up each bill, careful and unhurried, and folded them once. He tucked them into his front pocket. Then he reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the worn leather journal. He held it for a moment in both hands. He looked at it. He tucked it more securely into the inner pocket of his coveralls close to his chest and pressed his palm flat against it once. Then he straightened. He looked at Richard directly, calm, steady, and entirely without expression for exactly 3 seconds. 2 corporate security guards appeared at his shoulders. They were professional, formal, and efficient. They did not grab him. They simply flanked him, and Marcus turned and walked with them toward the service exit. His footsteps were even. His pace was unhurried. His back was straight. He walked the way a man walks when he has already decided that the room behind him is no longer worth looking at. The glass doors closed. The lobby remained silent for another full breath. Then Richard straightened his cuffs, smoothed the front of his jacket, and turned toward the elevator banks. "Back to work," he said. He said it pleasantly, the way a man says something pleasant when he is certain the conversation is over. The lobby began to breathe again, slowly, carefully, and with the particular relief of people grateful not to have been chosen. Sarah stood at the corridor entrance. She stared at the service exit doors long after they had closed. She pressed her lips together. She turned. She walked back to her desk, sat down, and placed both hands flat on the surface in front of her. The drafting table was bare. The model was gone. The blueprint was gone. The folder was gone. 14 weeks of her life sat in a presentation suite 2 floors above her wearing Richard's name. She stared at the empty table. She said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Now back to Marcus. The service exit opened onto a narrow concrete loading corridor, low-ceilinged, fluorescent lit, and smelling of exhaust and cold stone. Marcus walked it without hurrying. The security guards stopped at the interior door. They did not follow him further. That was the arrangement. That was always the arrangement. The building released you at the threshold and left the rest to the street. He pushed through the exterior door. The city hit him immediately. The wind came first. Bitter, biting, and entirely without mercy, it cut across his face and found every gap in the thin fabric of his coveralls, the open collar, the worn cuffs, the place where the zipper no longer sat quite flush. He stopped on the concrete step for a moment, eyes closed, jaw set. The heavy corporate glass doors swung shut behind him with a solid, final click. The lock engaged. He heard it clearly. That small, mechanical sound, precise and indifferent, carried more weight than anything Richard had said in the lobby. He walked to the bus bench at the corner. He sat down. The bench was cold cracked along one armrest and anchored to the sidewalk with the kind of permanence that only things nobody cared about ever achieved. He sat on it the way he had sat on many benches like it, without complaint, without performance, without any audience to perform for. The morning traffic moved past him in both directions, taxis and delivery trucks, and the long, indifferent river of the city going about its business. Nobody looked at him. Nobody slowed. 2 floors above the street, behind glass that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month, Richard Vance was opening a bottle of Dom Pérignon. The cork came out with a celebratory pop that nobody on the street could hear. He poured 2 glasses. He set one at the empty chair reserved for the billionaire client. He raised his own and drank slow and satisfied, surrounded by colleagues who laughed at his jokes because they had mortgages and ambitions and very little courage. Marcus sat on the cracked bench and watched a pigeon navigate a discarded paper cup near his shoe. He had done this before. Not this exactly, not this particular lobby and this particular man and this particular morning, but the shape of it was familiar. He had spent enough of his life being looked through by people who mistook the cost of his clothing for the content of his character. He had learned early that the world sorted people quickly, efficiently, and almost entirely by surface. The coveralls were a surface, the mop handle was a surface, the scuffed boots and the calloused hands and the service entrance were all surfaces, and surfaces were what most people never looked past. That had been in the beginning an injury. Later, it had become a tool. He reached into his breast pocket. He withdrew the worn leather journal cracked at the spine and soft at the corners from years of handling. He opened it. The morning wind pushed at the pages and he held them flat with one hand, patient and practiced. He found the current page. He looked at the equations, the load distributions, the wind coefficients, the stress accumulation figures he had been refining for weeks. He looked at the circled number. He looked at the 3 words beside it. He looked at the red circle Richard had erased from the blueprint, the circle that was still here intact and precise on this page because erasure only works on what it can reach. Between 2 pages near the back of the journal, something caught the thin winter light. He separated the pages carefully. Inside, flat and cool against his fingers, lay a solid platinum card, matte black, entirely unmarked except for a single embossed sequence of numbers along its lower edge. Beside it, folded once and worn soft at the creases, was a document. He unfolded it slowly. It was a master deed, clean, legal, signed, and current. The registered development entity at the top read Solace Capital Partners. The signatory at the bottom in his own handwriting read Marcus J. Webb. He looked at it for a long moment. The wind pushed at the edges of the page. He held it still. He had built Solace Capital Partners across 9 years from a single correct call on a distressed commercial property in Newark that everyone else had dismissed as worthless and that he had recognized through careful structural analysis and patient research as recoverable. He had been wearing different clothes then, not much different. He had learned the value of invisibility early, before he learned the value of anything else. The invisibility had protected him when he needed protection. It had given him time to watch, to learn, and to understand how power worked when it believed no one important was watching. He had watched Richard Vance for 3 months. That was what the night shift placement had been. Not necessity, not coincidence, selection. He had chosen this firm, this floor, this particular set of gleaming Italian marble tiles because Vance and Associates had submitted a proposal to Solace Capital Partners for a $500 million development contract. and Marcus had a policy consistent and absolute of evaluating the character of a firm's leadership before he evaluated anything else. Character in his experience revealed itself most completely when power believed it was unobserved. He refolded the deed. He slid it back between the pages. He held the journal closed in both hands and looked at the street in front of him, at the taxis and the delivery trucks, and the city moving past without pausing or noticing or caring. He thought about Sarah. He thought about 14 weeks of work sitting in a presentation suite wearing someone else's name. He thought about a red circle erased without reading. He thought about what it meant to build something careful and precise and true, and then to watch someone take it with both hands and call it theirs, not because they had earned it, but simply because they believed they could. He thought about the 40th floor, the wind shear coefficient, the stress accumulation figures, the progressive failure that would build slowly and invisibly inside a structure that looked correct on the surface until it didn't. He opened the journal again. He uncapped the pen. He wrote 4 lines beneath the existing equations, compact and precise. He capped the pen. He read the 4 lines back. He nodded once, small and private. Then he took out his phone. He made a single call. It lasted 40 seconds. He said very little. He listened more. When he ended the call, he sat for another moment on the cold, cracked bench, the platinum card warm now from his handling. The journal closed against his chest. He stood up. He looked up at the building. Glass and steel and money and the absolute certainty held by everyone inside it that the doors which had just locked behind him were the last word on the subject. They were not the last word. He had a suit and a car 2 blocks east. He had a meeting to attend. He had been on the VIP guest list since the contract was first proposed, listed not as a janitor, not as a night shift worker, not as the man who had spent 11 months mopping Italian marble while the firm's senior partner walked past him without seeing, but as the sole investor, the named client, the one empty chair in the presentation suite that Richard had toasted with a $500 bottle of champagne. Marcus tucked the journal into his inner pocket. He pressed his palm flat against it once. He walked east. His pace was even, his back straight, and his expression calm, patient, and entirely without hurry. He had nowhere to rush to. Everything he needed was already in motion. Richard didn't know who was actually on the VIP guest list, but he was about to find out. The executive boardroom occupied the entire north face of the 50th floor. It was a room designed specifically to make people feel the weight of money, the particular pressurized gravity of a space where significant things happened to significant people. The mahogany table ran 20 feet down the center, polished to a depth that reflected the ceiling lights like still water. The chairs were deep leather and arranged with military precision. The glass walls looked out over Manhattan in every direction, cold and vast and entirely indifferent to whatever was about to happen inside. 50 architects sat in those chairs. They had arrived early, arranged their materials, poured their water, and settled into the particular attentive stillness of people who understood that today mattered. The $500 million Solace Tower contract was the largest single commission in the firm's 40-year history. Everyone in the room knew it. Everyone in the room had dressed accordingly. At the head of the table, Richard stood. He was composed, polished, and entirely in his element. His bespoke suit sat perfectly on his shoulders. His collar was crisp, his cuffs were straight, and his Patek Philippe caught the morning light each time he moved his hand across the presentation materials. He had arranged Sarah's model at the center of the display table, the skyscraper rising clean and ambitious from its base exactly as she had built it. He had arranged her blueprints beside it, her load calculations, her structural notes, 14 weeks of meticulous work laid out beneath his name on the presentation cover sheet. He had not credited her. He had not intended to. At the far end of the table, one chair sat empty. It was set apart from the others, slightly angled and marked with a small embossed card that read, "Reserved, Solace Capital Partners." Richard had glanced at it twice already this morning. He glanced at it again now. He cleared his throat. He looked at his watch. He began. "Gentlemen," Richard said, his voice carrying effortlessly to every corner of the room, What you are looking at represents the next generation of vertical urban design. He moved to the model. He placed one hand near its base, proprietary and deliberate. The structural approach here is entirely original. The load distribution system is something my team and I developed over months of intensive research. He paused. He let the pause carry. It is, I believe, the most sophisticated wind-resistant framework this firm has ever produced. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked at the empty chair. 50 architects watched Richard perform with the polite, careful attention of people who had learned that survival in this building required an ability to watch things happen without appearing to have opinions about them. Richard continued. He moved through the presentation with practiced confidence fluid and assured describing load paths he had not calculated structural decisions. He had not made physics he did not understand. He used Sarah's terminology precisely because he had spent the previous evening reading her notes, absorbing her language, and reassembling it into the first-person singular with seamless, practiced ease. He was halfway through the wind resistance section when the boardroom doors opened. The sound was not loud. The mahogany doors of the 50th floor boardroom were engineered for discretion, weighted and balanced to open and close without drama. But the sound they made when Marcus pushed through them carried into the room with the particular quality of a sound that arrives at exactly the wrong moment for the person it interrupts. Richard stopped mid-sentence. He looked up. Every head in the room turned. Marcus stood in the doorway. He was wearing a suit. Not a suit in the general sense. Not the kind of dark department store armor that people wore to signal seriousness. A bespoke Tom Ford suit, charcoal and immaculate cut, with the kind of precision that does not announce itself loudly, but that every person in a room full of people who understood tailoring would notice immediately and completely. His shirt was white, his tie was dark, and his shoes were the kind of black Oxford that communicated without effort or intention that the man wearing them had never once in his adult life needed to prove anything to anyone. He walked in. 2 security guards moved immediately fast and practiced flanking him from both sides. They reached for his arms. Marcus did not accelerate. He did not slow. He reached into his inner jacket pocket with his right hand and withdrew a document. He held it at his side as he walked unhurried and straight to the head of the table. He set it down. The sound it made, the heavy, flat, final thud of paper against polished mahogany, hit the room like something physical, like a door closing, like a verdict being delivered, like the specific sound of something ending. Every conversation in the room stopped. Every breath in the room stopped. The security guard stopped. Richard stared at the document. It was the master deed, clean, signed, and current. The registered entity at the top read Solace Capital Partners. The signatory at the bottom read Marcus J. Webb. "I believe," Marcus said, his voice level, quiet, and carrying to every corner of the room without effort, "that chair at the end of the table is mine." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard's face moved through several expressions in rapid, involuntary succession. Confusion first, then recognition, then something that was not quite fear, but was close enough to it to be indistinguishable from the outside. His collar, crisp and perfect 30 seconds ago, suddenly appeared to fit differently. A line of color rose from his neck. One of the board members spoke. His voice was careful and precise. "Mr. Webb, we were not informed that you would be attending in person." "No," Marcus said. He looked at Richard as he said it. "You were not." He moved to the display table. He stood before the model, Sarah's model, and looked at it for a long, quiet moment. He looked at the blueprints. He looked at the cover sheet with Richard's name printed at the top. He looked at the section of the blueprint where a red circle had been, where 3 numbers and a coefficient had been, where the notation had been careful and precise and completely erased. He reached into his jacket pocket. He withdrew a red pen. The room watched him draw. He worked without hesitation, placing the circle at the 40th floor wind shear point with the same steady, calloused hand that had drawn it the first time. He wrote the 3 numbers. He wrote the coefficient. He set the pen down and looked up. "This design," Marcus said, "has a fatal flaw." His voice was measured, deliberate, and fully controlled. He looked at Richard. The wind shear loading above the 40th floor is not accounted for in the structural framework as presented. The lateral stress accumulation at that elevation in a sustained 60-mile-per-hour crosswind event will produce progressive failure in the building's primary load-bearing system. He paused. Not immediately, over time, invisibly, until it isn't invisible anymore. He reached into his jacket again. He withdrew the leather journal. He opened it to the current page and held it up. The equations were projected simultaneously onto the presentation screen behind him, clean and precise, fed from a tablet that his assistant had positioned at the room's AV input 40 minutes earlier. These calculations, Marcus said, were completed on the night of the 12th in this building at approximately 11 p.m. He looked at Richard. You erased them from the blueprint the following morning. You called them worthless janitor graffiti. He closed the journal. They are the only thing standing between this building and a structural failure that would kill people. The room did not move. Richard's jaw was set rigid and working slightly the way a jaw works when the mind behind it is cycling through options and finding each one worse than the last. His collar was visibly damp now. His Patek Philippe caught the light as his hand moved to the table's edge and gripped it tight, white-knuckled, and entirely involuntary. This is absurd, Richard said. His voice was still controlled, barely. This man was a janitor in this building. He was terminated this morning for cause. Whatever he has written in that notebook is not peer-reviewed structural analysis. It is not a credible challenge to a design developed by a licensed architectural team over months of professional work. He looked at the board. He was speaking to the board now, deliberately redirecting. I would ask that security remove this individual and allow us to continue. Nobody moved. The board member who had spoken before looked at the deed on the table. He looked at the projection on the screen. He looked at the red circle on the blueprint. He looked at Marcus. Mr. Vance, the board member said quietly, the deed is registered. The signatory is verified. Mr. Webb is the contracting client. He paused. I think we should hear him out. Richard looked at the board member. He looked at the room. He looked at the 50 architects sitting in their deep leather chairs, watching him with the particular careful attention of people who had been doing internal calculations for the past 4 minutes and had arrived at conclusions they were not yet ready to express out loud. Sarah sat near the far wall. She had been there when Marcus entered. She had not moved since. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her, still and steady, and her eyes had not left Marcus from the moment the boardroom doors opened. She was watching the man who had fixed her model standing in front of the room that had stolen it, and she was not breathing quite normally, and she did not attempt to disguise it. Marcus looked at her once, brief and direct. He looked back at Richard. I am not here to debate the mathematics, Marcus said. His voice was calm, patient, and entirely without anger. Anger would have been easier to dismiss. The equations are available for independent peer review. I welcome it. I have in fact already requested it. He reached into his jacket one final time and withdrew a second document, slim and precise. He set it on the table beside the deed. This is a preliminary structural assessment from Meridian Engineering Group completed at 6 this morning based on the original calculations. He looked at Richard. They agree with the red circle. Richard said nothing. The room said nothing. Outside the glass walls, Manhattan continued its indifferent, enormous business taxis and towers, and the cold winter light falling across 50 floors of steel and glass, entirely unaware that in one room near the top of one building, a very specific kind of reckoning had just reached the moment it could no longer be deferred. Marcus straightened his jacket. He looked at Richard one final time, calm, composed, and entirely without performance. He had not raised his voice once. He had not needed to. He had simply placed one fact beside another fact, until the arrangement of them said everything that needed saying. I think, Marcus said quietly, that we should discuss the contract. And that was when Marcus dropped the final devastating hammer. The room waited. It had been waiting collectively and without quite realizing it since the moment the mahogany doors opened. 50 architects sat in their deep leather chairs, motionless, silent, and acutely aware that what happened in the next 60 seconds would determine the shape of everything that followed. The model stood at the center of the display table. The deed lay flat on the mahogany beside the meridian assessment. The red circle sat on the blueprint, redrawn patient, and entirely irrefutable. Marcus reached into his jacket. He withdrew a single document. It was slim, clean, and printed on heavyweight contract paper, the kind used for agreements that carry real consequence. He held it for a moment. He looked at Richard. Then he set it on the table center and deliberate in the space between the deed and the model. It was the $500 million Solace Tower contract. Richard recognized it immediately. His eyes dropped to it with the reflexive, involuntary focus of a man who had spent the previous 48 hours believing that document was already his. His jaw tightened. His hand moved on the table's edge. Marcus picked up the contract. He held it in both hands. He looked at it briefly, unhurried and entirely calm. Then he tore it, clean and deliberate from top to bottom, a single long motion, precise and final. The sound it made was sharp, satisfying, and completely impossible to misinterpret. He set the two halves flat on the table. He smoothed them once with his palm. He stepped back. The room did not breathe. "Richard Vance," Marcus said. His voice was level, quiet, and carrying. "You are terminated. Effective immediately. The grounds are intellectual property theft, gross professional negligence, and deliberate falsification of design authorship on a $500 million contract submission." He paused. One beat. Measured and exact. "Your architectural license will be referred to the State Board for review. The Meridian report, the original calculations, and the verified deed have already been forwarded to the firm's legal counsel and to the relevant regulatory body. This morning." Richard's face had gone through color. It had moved from flush to white to something between them, a gray, stunned pallor that had nothing to do with the lighting. He looked at the torn contract. He looked at the deed. He looked at the room, the 50 architects in their chairs, and found in their collective expression precisely nothing that resembled support or rescue. "This is," Richard started. His voice was different now. The control was still there, but it was structural rather than confident, the kind of control that exists not because a person is calm, but because letting it go would be catastrophic. "This is a gross overreaction to a professional disagreement. The design was a collaborative effort. Attribution in a firm of this size is always a matter of—" "The blueprints carry her drafting code," Marcus said, quietly, simply. "Every load calculation in that folder is initialed in her hand. The structural notes are in her handwriting. The model was built on her workbench over 14 weeks. He looked at Richard with the patient, precise expression of a man who had prepared for exactly this sentence. "There is no collaborative ambiguity here." Richard looked at Sarah. It was a different look than any he had given her before. Not contempt, not threat. Something unguarded and almost confused, the look of a man encountering for the first time a situation his particular architecture of entitlement had never been designed to handle. Sarah looked back at him. She said nothing. She did not need to. The boardroom doors opened. 4 people entered. 2 were corporate security, formal and deliberate. 2 were individuals Marcus had called that morning representatives of the state licensing board and the firm's own legal counsel present, because Marcus had requested their presence and because Marcus was the client, and the client had been very specific about the morning's schedule. They moved to Richard with professional efficiency, quiet, coordinated, and entirely without drama. One of the security guards spoke briefly into Richard's ear. Richard's body went through something complicated. His shoulders dropped first. Then his hands released the table's edge. Then slowly, with the particular awful gravity of a large thing losing its structural support, his knees buckled. He went down. His expensive Armani slacks caught on the carpet's edge as he sank, and the fabric tore at the knee with a small, precise sound, quiet but clearly audible in the absolute silence of the room. He was on his knees on the boardroom carpet, the $4,000 suit ruined at the joint, his Patek Philippe still catching the light on his wrist. his monogrammed cuffs still straight, the last details of the performance intact, while everything beneath them collapsed entirely. "Please," Richard said. The word came out stripped of everything that had previously accompanied his voice, the control, the precision, the practiced weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed. It came out as just a word, small, bare, and too late. "I have built this firm 22 years. Everything in this building exists because of decisions I made and risks I took, and—" "Stand up, please, Mr. Vance," one of the legal representatives said, not unkindly, simply finally. The handcuffs came out. Corporate security acting on authority established by the firm's own legal counsel, and the morning's verified documentation locked them onto Richard's wrists with a sharp, clean, metallic click. The sound was small. It was also the most significant sound the room had produced all morning. It landed in the silence with the particular weight of something that could not be taken back. The same guards who had flanked Marcus at the boardroom entrance, the same guards who had reached for his arms 40 minutes earlier, now walked Richard Vance toward the mahogany doors. Richard did not look at the model. He did not look at the deed. He looked once at the torn contract on the table. Then he looked at the floor. His footsteps were uneven, quiet, and entirely without the deliberate proprietary weight they had carried every other time he had crossed a room in this building. The doors closed behind him. The room held its silence for 3 full seconds. Then, slowly and carefully, like a collective breath released after long submersion, it began to breathe again. Marcus looked at the board. He was composed, patient, and entirely unhurried. "The Solace Tower project will proceed," he said. "Under a new contract with corrected structural specifications that account for the 40th floor wind shear loading," he paused. "The project requires a lead architect, someone who understands the structural framework at the level required to build it correctly, safely, and completely." He looked at Sarah. She was standing now. She had not noticed herself stand. She was upright still, and her hands, which had been flat on the table for the past 20 minutes, were now loose at her sides, open and quiet. Her face was composed, controlled, and entirely unable to disguise the thing moving behind it. She looked at Marcus with the expression of a person encountering an outcome they had stopped believing in sometime around midnight the previous evening. "Sarah," Marcus said. His voice was simple and direct. "The project is yours. Lead architect, full credit, full authority, and full contractual recognition." He looked at the board. "Effective immediately." The board member who had spoken twice before nodded once, slow and deliberate. Around him, the others followed, unhurried, considered, and unanimous. Sarah looked at the model. Her model standing at the center of the table, clean and ambitious, and precisely as she had built it, minus the drift, minus the lean stable now at every joint. She looked at the red circle on the blueprint, redrawn in the same hand that had first drawn it, still patient, still precise, still entirely correct. She looked at Marcus. She pressed her lips together. She nodded once. It was small, tight, and contained multitudes. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady, quiet, and composed. She had promised herself sometime in the previous 12 hours that if this moment arrived, she would not cry in the boardroom. She kept the promise. Barely. Marcus nodded. He looked at the room one final time, calm and complete. He picked up the deed from the table. He picked up the Meridian report. He left the 2 halves of the torn contract where they lay center and deliberate flat on the polished mahogany because some things were worth leaving visible. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at the model once more briefly and quietly. He walked to the boardroom doors. He paused there for a moment, his hand against the mahogany. He did not look back. He did not need to. He simply said it quietly and without theater to the room and to nobody in particular and to everyone entirely. "True excellence doesn't announce itself with a title." A brief pause. "It simply performs." The mahogany doors opened. Marcus walked through them. They closed behind him with the same soft, weighted sound they had made when he arrived, quiet, final, and completely certain of itself. In the boardroom, 50 architects sat in complete silence. On the table, the torn contract lay in 2 clean halves. The model stood at the center stable, ambitious and exactly as it had always been meant to be. The red circle waited on the blueprint patient and permanent. Sarah stood at the head of the table. She looked at the empty chair at the far end, the chair with the embossed card that read, "Reserved, Solace Capital Partners." She looked at the model. She looked at the red circle. She sat down in the lead architect's chair. She placed her hands flat on the table. She looked at the board. "All right," she said. Her voice was calm, clear, and entirely ready. "Let's build it correctly." Closing fiction. But that feeling of watching your hard work get stolen by someone with more power, we've all been there. What would you do if your arrogant boss took credit for your late nights? Drop a comment, like, share, subscribe.